A lonely Cherokee hunter bought a mute girl sold by her gambling father at a frontier trading post, then discovered she could spirits of the dead, and they had been waiting decades to deliver a warning that would change the fate of his people forever. The year was 1867, and the Cherokee nation was bleeding. Not from war that had ended 3 years ago, but from the slow, relentless wound of broken promises and stolen land.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
In the rugged mountains of what would one day be called eastern Oklahoma, where ancient oak trees still whispered secrets in the Cherokee tongue, lived a man who had turned his back on both worlds. Wally Stonecrow was 38 years old, though grief had carved lines around his eyes that belonged to a much older man. His Cherokee name meant eagle, a fitting title for someone who now soared alone above the world, watching but never landing among his own people. He stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of hunting and hauling, his long black hair streaked with premature silver that caught the morning light like frost on winter grass. His hands were scarred from knife work and rope burns, his face weathered by wind and sun, but his eyes dark as obsidian and twice as sharp still held the fierce intelligence that had once made him a respected voice in tribal councils. Now, he spoke to no one but the wind. Wohali lived alone in a cabin he built with his own hands, nestled in a valley where Crying Wolf Creek meandered through stands of hickory and pine. The cabin was simple but solid, thick log walls chinked with clay and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly, windows made from real glass he'd traded 3 wolf pelts to obtain. Inside, the space was sparse but organized in narrow bed, with quilts his grandmother had made, a table scarred by years of use, shelves lined with hunting tools and books he'd learned to read in the mission schools. On the mantel above the fireplace sat the only photograph he owned, his wife Ayana, and their daughter Singing Bird, taken just months before the fever took them both. He looked at their faces every morning, as if their smiles might somehow change or forgive him for surviving when they had not. The Cherokee called him Nightwalker now, for he hunted when others slept and avoided the settlements where his people struggled to rebuild their lives. He'd served as a scout for the Union Army during the war, a decision that had cost him friends and allies among his own people. Some Cherokee had fought for the Confederacy, others for the Union, and the wounds of that division ran deeper than any battlefield injury. But Wohali had chosen his side for one reason. The Union had promised to honor Cherokee sovereignty after the war. It was another lie, of course, but by the time he realized it, his wife and daughter were dead, and the weight of his choices had become a burden too heavy to share. His days followed the same pattern they had for 3 years: rise before dawn, check the trap lines that stretched for miles through the forest, hunt deer and elk in the high meadows, and return to his cabin before the sun touched the western ridges. He sold his furs and meat at Bent Creek Trading Post once a month, speaking only when necessary, buying only what he needed to survive. The rest of the time, he lived in silence broken only by the crack of his rifle and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Wohali had been raised to believe that all things had spirits: the trees, the streams, the animals he hunted. His grandmother, old woman dancing, had taught him to listen for the voices that spoke between heartbeats, to honor the balance between the living and the dead. But since losing his family, those voices had gone quiet, as if even the spirits had abandoned him to his grief. He preferred it that way. Silence was safer than hope, and solitude hurt less than the weight of other people's expectations. The war was over, the treaties were signed, and his people were trying to rebuild their nation on land that grew smaller with each passing year. They needed leaders, healers, teachers, men who could bridge the gap between the old ways and the new world pressing in from all sides. Wohali had once been such a man. Now he was just a hunter who traded pelts for supplies and tried not to remember the sound of his daughter's laughter, The morning that would change everything started like any other. October had painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Wohali rose in the gray hour before dawn, built up the fire, and prepared for another day of checking his trap lines. He'd noticed sign of a large buck in the high meadows tracks that suggested an animal worth pursuing. With winter coming, he needed every hide and every pound of meat he could gather. He was loading his saddlebags when he heard it, the distant sound of wheels on the rocky trail that led to Bent Creek trading post. It was too early for the supply wagon and too late in the season for most travelers. Curious despite himself, Wohali climbed to his cabin's roof and used his army field glasses to scan the trail below. A single wagon was making its way toward the trading post, pulled by two tired-looking mules. Even from a distance, Wohali could see that something was wrong. The wagon lurched and swayed as if the driver was having trouble controlling the animals. Black smoke poured from what looked like a small cooking fire in the wagon, that dangerous on a moving vehicle and foolish. In the dry autumn woods, Wohali's first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever trouble was heading toward Bent Creek trading post wasn't his concern. He had pelts to collect and winter preparations to complete. But something made him pause, maybe the old instincts from his scouting days, or maybe just the stubborn sense of responsibility his grandmother had beaten into him with willow switches and Cherokee wisdom. He saddled his horse, a sturdy paint gelding named Thunder Walker, and rode down from his valley toward the trading post. By the time he reached the dusty yard in front of the log building, the wagon had arrived and was already drawing the crowd. Bent Creek Trading Post sat at the intersection of two rough trails, one leading east toward Arkansas and white settlements, the other winding north into Cherokee territory. The post was owned by Samuel Bent, a white man who'd married into the Cherokee Nation and somehow managed to maintain friendships on both sides of the racial divide that split the territory. His store was a rough log building with a covered porch, where men gathered to trade news, liquor, and lies in equal measure. This morning, the usual collection of traders, drifters, and Cherokee farmers had gathered around the smoking wagon. Wohali recognized most of them: Tom Silver Hawk, who ran a small farm near the post; Jacob Morrison, a white trader who dealt in horses and whiskey; and several Cherokee men whose names he'd forgotten, but whose faces still carried the weight of recent hardships. At the center of the crowd stood a man Wohali had never seen before, a thin white man with a scraggly beard and clothes that might have been fashionable 5 years ago but now hung on his frame like burial shrouds. The man swayed slightly as he talked, and even from horseback, Wohali could smell the whiskey on him. Gentlemen, the stranger was saying, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a carnival barker. Today is your lucky day. Today you have the opportunity to acquire something truly special, a genuine, authentic, one-of-a-kind curiosity. The man gestured toward the wagon bed, where the smoke was beginning to clear. Through the dissipating haze, Wohali could see what looked like a pile of ragged blankets. Then the blankets moved, and he realized it was a person, a girl, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, sat huddled in the corner of the wagon bed. Her dress had once been blue but was now faded to the color of old bruises. Her feet were bare and dirty, her dark hair tangled and matted. But it was her eyes that caught Wohali's attention, large, dark eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at the same time. She don't talk, don't make a sound, the man continued, oblivious to the growing discomfort of his audience. Been that way since birth, her mama claimed. But she's got other qualities, gentlemen. She can cook, clean, mend clothes. Hardy as a mule, and twice as useful. Tom Silver Hawk stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. Mister, what exactly are you suggesting? The stranger's grin widened, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. I'm suggesting nothing, friend. I'm offering a straightforward business proposition.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The girl's father, that would be me, has debts to pay. Gambling debts, if you must. No, honest debts to honest men who expect their money back. You're selling your own daughter? This came from Jacob Morrison, who, despite his reputation as a hard man, looked sickened by the proposal. Selling such an ugly word, the man replied. I prefer to think of it as finding her a good home. Someone who can provide for her, give her a purpose. She's eating me out of house and home, and what's she giving back? Nothing but silence and vacant stares. The girl hadn't moved during this exchange. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on something beyond the crowd, beyond the trading post, beyond the mountains themselves. There was something unsettling about her stillness, not the relaxed quiet of someone at peace, but the frozen immobility of a rabbit sensing a wolf nearby. Woholi found himself studying her face. Despite the dirt and tangled hair, she was beautiful in the way that wildflowers were beautiful naturally without trying to be. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The girl's lips were moving slightly, as if she was speaking, but no sound emerged. Her eyes tracked movement that no one else could see. What's wrong with her mind? Samuel Bent asked, emerging from his store to investigate the commotion. The stranger waved dismissively. Nothing wrong with her mind, just her tongue. Doctor back in Arkansas said she was born simple, but I think she's just stubborn. Either way, she follows orders well enough, and she's got a knack for knowing things before they happen. Weather, mostly, but other things too. What kind of other things? Tom Silverhawk asked suspiciously. The man's grin faltered slightly. Well, she knew my horse was going to go lame 2 days before it happened. Kept pointing at his left front hoof, trying to tell me something. And last month, she started acting all strange the night before that big storm hit, you remember, the one that knocked down half the trees between here and Fort Gibson. Started pacing around like a caged animal, wouldn't settle down until the wind started blowing. Several men in the crowd exchanged glances. Among the Cherokee, such abilities were not unheard of, but they were treated with respect and caution. A person who could sense coming storms or predict illness in animals might be blessed with powerful medicine, or cursed with something darker. How much? The question came from Jacob Morrison, though he looked ashamed to be asking it. Well now, that depends on the buyer. She's young, healthy, good for many years of service. I was thinking $50 would be fair. The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. $50 was more than most Cherokee families saw in cash money over the course of a year. It was also, Woholi realized with disgust, roughly the same price a good horse would bring at auction. $50 is robbery, Tom Silverhawk declared. And what you're doing is worse than robbery. The stranger's face hardened. What I'm doing is legal. She's my daughter, my responsibility, and I got the right to find her a home where she'd be cared for. You Cherokee ought to understand that. I heard you folks used to trade children all the time, back in the old days. This was a dangerous lie, and everyone present knew it. The Cherokee had never practiced slavery in the way white settlers understood it, and children were considered sacred gifts to be protected and cherished. Several of the Cherokee men stepped forward, their hands moving toward the knives at their belts. Samuel Bent, sensing violence in the air, raised his hands for peace. Now gentlemen, let's keep this civil. Mr. Fletcher, Jeremiah Fletcher, late of Little Rock, Arkansas. Mr. Fletcher, I think you might want to reconsider your approach here. These are good Christian men, and they don't take kindly to certain kinds of business. Fletcher's eyes darted around the circle of hostile faces, finally seeming to understand that his sales pitch wasn't being well received. Look, I don't want to cause trouble. I just need to settle my debts before certain parties come looking for their money. The girl's going to end up somewhere. Might as well be with folks who'll treat her decent. What if she doesn't want to go with anyone? This question came from an unexpected source, a Cherokee woman named Blue Swan who had been listening from the trading post porch. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair braided in the traditional way and eyes that missed nothing. Fletcher laughed harshly. What? She don't want nothing because she can't think nothing. Look at her sitting there like a lump of clay. She go where she's told and do what she's told, same as she always has. Blue Swan stepped down from the porch and walked to the wagon. She looked up at the girl and spoke in Cherokee gentle words that Wohali recognized as a traditional greeting between women. The girl's head turned slightly, and for just a moment, her eyes focused on Blue Swan's face. She understands, Blue Swan said quietly. Maybe she can't speak, but she understands. Understanding and thinking ain't the same thing, Fletcher replied. But his voice had lost some of its conviction. Wohali had been silent through all of this, watching and listening with the patience he'd learned as a scout. Something about the situation was wrong. Not just Fletcher's obvious desperation or his willingness to sell his own daughter, but something deeper. The girl's behavior bothered him. She sat too still, watched too carefully, and there was an alertness in her posture that contradicted Fletcher's claims about her mental condition. I'll take her. The words were out of his mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. Every face in the crowd turned toward him, and Wohali felt a familiar surge of regret for calling attention to himself. But it was too late to take the words back. Fletcher's eyes lit up with greedy satisfaction. Well now, that's more like it. Mr. Stonecrow, Wohali Stonecrow. Mr. Stonecrow, you look like a man who knows quality when he sees it. The girl will serve you well, I guarantee it. I'm not buying her, Wohali said flatly. I'm taking responsibility for her. There's a difference. Fletcher's smile faltered. I'm afraid I don't understand the distinction. $50 is $50, regardless of your intentions. Wohali rode his horse closer to the wagon, close enough to see the girl clearly. Up close, he could see that her dress had been patched many times with mismatched fabric, and there were old bruises on her arms that spoke of rough treatment. But it was her eyes that held his attention, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to be pleading for something he couldn't identify. 25, Wohali said. I told you, 50 is the price. Take it or leave it. 25, Wohali repeated. Or I ride away and let you explain to these folks why you're selling your daughter like livestock. Fletcher glanced around at the hostile faces surrounding him and seemed to realize that his bargaining position was weaker than he'd thought. The Cherokee men were openly glaring at him now, and even the white traders looked disgusted by his behavior. 35, he countered weakly. 25. A long silence stretched between them while Fletcher weighed his options. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. Fine, $25, but I want it in cash, and I want it now. Wohali dismounted and pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebags. He counted out 25 silver dollars, nearly half of his savings from 3 years of hunting and trapping, and placed them in Fletcher's outstretched palm. There's one more thing, Wohali said as Fletcher pocketed the money. I want you to climb up in that wagon and ask her if she wants to come with me. What? Why would you? She can't answer you. Ask her anyway. Fletcher looked around the crowd and saw no sympathy for his position. Muttering under his breath, he climbed into the wagon bed and knelt beside the girl. Listen up, girl. This Cherokee fellow here is taking you home with him. You got any objection to that? The girl looked at Fletcher for a long moment, then turned her gaze to Wohali. For several seconds, she studied his face with the same intensity. He'd seen her use when watching invisible things in the distance. Then slowly, she stood up. She was taller than he'd expected, perhaps 5.5 feet, and despite her apparent frailty, she moved with a fluid grace that reminded him of deer stepping through forest shadows. She walked to the edge of the wagon bed and held out her hand to Woholi. He stepped forward and helped her down from the wagon. Her hand was small in his, calloused from work but trembling slightly, whether from fear or cold, he couldn't tell. She landed lightly on her feet and immediately stepped behind him, as if seeking protection from the crowd's stares. Fletcher climbed down from the wagon, counting his money and avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Well, that's settled then. She's your problem now, Stonecrow. Don't say I didn't warn you when she starts acting strange." "What's her name?" Woholi asked. Fletcher paused in his counting. "Name? Oh, right, Mary. Her name's Mary Fletcher." It was obviously a lie. Fletcher had hesitated too long, and the name didn't fit the girl any more than his shabby clothes fit his desperate circumstances. But Woholi didn't press the issue. Whatever her real name was, she could tell him herself. When she was ready, Fletcher climbed back onto his wagon seat and took up the reins. "Pleasure doing business with you folks. I'll be heading back to Arkansas now, try to rebuild my life." He paused and looked down at the girl one last time. "You. Be good, Mary. Try not to cause this man too much trouble." The girl didn't acknowledge him. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground at Woholi's feet, as if the packed dirt held secrets only she could read. Fletcher drove away without looking back, his wagon disappearing around the bend that led toward Arkansas and whatever debts were chasing him. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement over but the questions just beginning. Blue Swan approached Woholi before he could mount his horse. "That was a good thing you did," she said in Cherokee. "But be careful. That girl has been touched by something powerful. I can feel it from here." "What kind of something?" Woholi asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The kind that walks between worlds," Blue Swan replied. "The kind that sees what others cannot. Your grandmother would have called it a gift. Others might call it a curse." She looked at the girl, who was still standing silently beside Woholi's horse. "What will you call her?" Woholi considered the question. The girl was clearly not named Mary, and Fletcher's other claims about her were probably lies as well. She needed a real name, a Cherokee name, that might help her find her place in a world that seemed to have rejected her. "Atsila," he said finally. "Fire. Should be called Atsila." Blue Swan nodded approvingly. "Fire burns away the darkness. It's a good name for one who sees hidden things." As if she'd heard and understood, the girl Atsila looked up for the first time since leaving the wagon. Her eyes met Woholi's, and he saw something there that made his breath catch. Recognition, gratitude, and something else that looked almost like hope. "Come on," he said gently, offering her his hand to help her mount behind him. "Let's go home." As they rode away from Bent Creek Trading Post, Woholi found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd acted on impulse, driven by disgust at Fletcher's behavior and sympathy for the girl's obvious distress. But taking responsibility for another person meant breaking the isolation he'd carefully maintained for 3 years. It meant noise, where he'd grown accustomed to silence, complications where he'd preferred simplicity. Behind him, Atsila rode without speaking, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist for balance. She seemed to weigh no more than a shadow, and except for the occasional shift in her position, he might have forgotten she was there. But as they climbed the winding trail toward his hidden valley, Woholi began to notice things that made him question everything Fletcher had told them about her condition. She was alert, for one thing. Her head turned constantly, tracking sounds and movements that caught her attention. When a hawk circled overhead, she looked up and watched its flight, pattern with the focused intensity of someone who understood predator behavior. When Thunderwalker's ears pricked forward at the sound of rustling underbrush, she tensed and leaned slightly to look in the same direction. More unsettling were the moments when she seemed to react to things he couldn't detect at all. Twice, during the ride, she suddenly stiffened and turned to stare at empty patches of forest, her eyes wide with what looked like recognition or fear. The second time it happened, Thunder Walker snorted and shied away from the same spot, as if he too sensed something hidden among the trees. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that reminded Wohley of old campfires and older stories. He helped Atsila down from the horse and led her toward the cabin. Suddenly self-conscious about his rough bachelor accommodations, the interior looked smaller with another person in it. More cluttered and obviously masculine, Atsila stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sparse furnishings, the hunting trophies on the walls, the photograph on the mantel. Her gaze lingered on the picture of his wife and daughter, and for a moment, her lips moved in what might have been a whispered word. Wohley built up the fire and lit the oil lamps, filling the cabin with warm, flickering light. He heated water for washing and found clean clothes that might fit her, an old shirt of his, and pants that could be cinched tight with a rope belt. When he turned to offer them to her, he found her standing perfectly still in the center of the room, her head tilted as if she was listening to something. "What is it?" he asked, then remembered that she couldn't hear him. Atsila turned slowly, her eyes scanning the cabin's corners and shadows. She walked to the fireplace and stood looking up at the photograph on the mantel. Without warning, she began to cry, not the dramatic sobbing of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, heartbroken tears of someone who understood loss in ways that went beyond words. Wohley approached her carefully, unsure how to comfort someone he couldn't communicate with normally. But as he drew near, Atsila did something that stopped him in his tracks. She spoke. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but the words were clear enough to understand. "They're still here. They've been waiting for someone who could see them." Wohley's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "What did you say?" Atsila turned to face him, tears still streaming down her cheeks. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, carrying the Cherokee accent he'd only heard in his grandmother's generation. "Your wife and daughter, they never left this place. They've been trying to tell you something, but you stopped listening when your heart broke." The photograph fell from the mantel as Wohley's trembling hands knocked it aside. It landed on the hearth with the sound of breaking glass, but neither of them looked down. They stood facing each other in the firelight, the hunter who had closed his heart to the spirit world, and the girl who could still hear the voices of the dead. And in that moment, Wohley realized that he hadn't rescued Atsila from anything. She had come to rescue him. The broken glass from the photograph lay scattered across the hearth like fallen stars, each shard catching the firelight and throwing tiny rainbows against the cabin walls. Wohley stared at the fragments, his mind reeling from what Atsila had just revealed. In 3 years of grief-soaked solitude, he had convinced himself that his wife and daughter were gone, truly gone, and that the Cherokee beliefs about spirits lingering in the world of the living were just old stories told to comfort the bereaved. But now this strange girl stood before him, tears still wet on her cheeks, claiming she could see and speak to the dead. More specifically, claiming she could see his dead. "You're lying," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Fletcher said you were simple-minded, that you couldn't even speak." Atsila wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dirt on her face. When she spoke again, her voice carried the soft, musical cadence of someone who had learned Cherokee as a first language, though Wohley was certain Fletcher had been white. "Jeremiah Fletcher found me 3 moons ago, wandering the roads near Fort Smith. He wasn't my father. My father died of the winter sickness when I was 12 summers old. Fletcher took me because I could predict which cards would fall in his gambling games, which horses would win races, which storms would bring the most rain. He made money from my gift until the other gamblers grew suspicious." She walked to the broken photograph and knelt beside the scattered glass. "But Fletcher never understood what I really am. He thought I was just lucky, or maybe cursed. He didn't know that I can hear the voices of those who have crossed over, but haven't yet found their way to the Nightland." Wohley's grandmother had told him stories of the Nightland, the Cherokee realm of the dead where spirits went to rest after their earthly journey was complete. According to the old teachings, some spirits became lost between worlds, trapped by unfinished business or undelivered messages for the living. If you can really hear them, Wohali said carefully, then tell me something only they would know. Atsila closed her eyes and tilted her head, as if listening to whispers only she could detect. When she opened them again, her expression was infinitely sad. Your wife's name was Kamama Butterfly. She used to sing while she cooked, always the same song about a mockingbird that learned to speak Cherokee from listening to the wind. Your daughter was called Singing Bird, but her secret name, the one only you and Kamama knew, was Little Storm, because she was born during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. Wohali's legs gave out, and he sank into the chair beside his table. Those were details he had never shared with anyone, secrets that had died with his family, or so he had thought. They want you to know that the fever wasn't your fault, Atsila continued, her voice gentle but relentless. You blame yourself for not being here when they died, for being away on that scouting mission for the army. But Kamama says the sickness would have taken them whether you were here or not. There was no medicine that could have saved them. Stop. The word came out as a broken whisper, but Atsila wasn't finished. Singing Bird wants you to know that she still has the wooden horse you carved for her last birthday. She carries it with her always, and she's been waiting to thank you for teaching her how to track deer by reading the signs in bent grass and broken twigs. Wohali buried his face in his hands. The wooden horse had been his final gift to his daughter. Carved during the long winter nights when Cherokee families gathered around fires to tell stories and work with their hands. He had painted it with red and yellow ochre, colors that matched the sunset she loved to watch from their cabin door. They're here now, Atsila said softly, standing right beside you. Kamama has her hand on your shoulder, and Singing Bird is trying to braid a flower into your hair, the way she used to do when you would let her play with styling your braids. Despite himself, Wohali felt a phantom touch on his shoulder, light as butterfly wings. The sensation was so real, so achingly familiar, that he had to fight not to turn and look for a face he knew he wouldn't be able to see. Why can you hear them when I can't? He asked. Atsila settled cross-legged on the floor, arranging her tattered skirts around her. My grandmother, my real grandmother, not the white woman who married my grandfather, told me that some people are born with their spirit eyes already open. She said it was because my soul was old, that I had lived many lives and learned to see beyond the veil that separates the worlds. She paused, her gaze growing distant. I've been able to hear the dead since I was very small. At first, my parents thought it was just the imagination of a lonely child. But as I grew older, the spirits began asking me to deliver messages to their living relatives. I would tell my mother that Mrs. Yellow Bear's deceased husband wanted her to know where he had hidden their savings, or that old Chief Rising Sun needed his son to complete a ceremony that had been interrupted by his death. What happened to your family? Wohali asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. The same thing that happened to many Cherokee families, Atsila replied with bitter acceptance. We lost our land to white settlers who had papers, saying it belonged to them now. My parents tried to fight in the courts, but lawyers cost money we didn't have. When we couldn't pay our debts, we lost everything, our home, our animals, even my mother's loom that had been passed down through 5 generations of women. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. My parents died that first winter after we lost the farm. They couldn't survive without the land that had sustained them all their lives. I tried to take care of myself, but a 16-year-old Cherokee girl wandering alone through white settlements. It wasn't safe. When Fletcher found me, I thought he might be my salvation. Instead, he became my captor. But you escaped. Atsila shook her head. I didn't escape. The spirits told me. That Fletcher was planning to sell me to a man in Little Rock who wanted someone to work in his brothel. They warned me that if I went with Fletcher to Arkansas, I would never see Cherokee land again. So when he stopped at Bent Creek Trading Post, I prayed to my ancestors to send me a protector. She looked directly at Wohali, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, and then you appeared. Wohali felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He had thought he was simply rescuing a girl from an abusive situation, but apparently he had become part of something much larger and more complex. What do they want? He asked. Kamama and Singing Bird, what are they trying to tell me? Atsila closed her eyes again, and when she opened them, her expression had changed. Her features seemed older somehow, as if she was channeling the wisdom of someone who had lived longer and seen more. There is danger coming, she said, and now her voice carried a different cadence, one that reminded Wohali painfully of his wife's speech patterns. Not just to you, but to all Cherokee people. The spirits of the ancestors are gathering, trying to warn the living, but few can hear their voices anymore. What kind of danger? The white government is planning to break the treaties again. They want to force the Cherokee to give up more land, to move further west where the soil is poor and the winters are harsh. But this time, they don't plan to negotiate. They plan to simply take what they want and dare anyone to stop them. Wohali's blood ran cold. After the Civil War, the Cherokee Nation had been forced to sign new treaties that reduced their territory and eliminated many of their rights. The promises made to secure Cherokee loyalty during the war had been broken almost before the ink was dry. But if the government was planning another forced relocation, when? He asked. Atsila's expression shifted again, and when she spoke, it was in the higher, sweeter voice of a child. Before the snow melts, Daddy, the bad men are coming before. The snow melts, and they have guns and papers that say we don't belong here anymore. Singing Bird. His daughter was speaking through Atsila, and the sound of that beloved voice nearly broke Wohali's heart all over again. The spirits have been trying to warn the living for months, Atsila continued, back in her own voice now. But the Cherokee leaders have stopped listening to the old ways. They put their faith in white man's law and white man's promises, forgetting that the spirits of their ancestors know things that can't be learned from books and treaties. Wohali stood and began pacing the small cabin, his mind racing. If what Atsila was telling him was true, if another forced relocation was being planned, then thousands of Cherokee lives were at stake. The last time the government had forced the Cherokee to move, in 1838, thousands had died on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Another such journey, especially in winter, would be genocide. Who else knows about this? He asked. Among the living? No one. The spirits have been trying to deliver warnings, but most people can no longer hear them. That's why they led me to you, Wohali. They know that you still have connections to Cherokee leaders, people who might listen if the warning came from someone they trusted. Wohali laughed bitterly. Trust? I'm called Nightwalker now, remember? I'm the Cherokee who fought for the Union, who lives alone in the mountains like a hermit. The tribal council barely acknowledges my existence. But your cousin Joseph Ridge still sits on the council, Atsila said. And your friend Thomas Downing runs the Cherokee newspaper. They would listen to you if you could provide proof of what's coming. She was right, though Wohali hated to admit it. Despite his self-imposed exile, he still had connections to Cherokee. Leadership through family ties and old friendships. Joseph Ridge was his mother's brother's son, a pragmatic politician who balanced traditional Cherokee values with the necessity of dealing with white authorities. Thomas Downing was an old Army friend who had started the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper to keep the scattered Cherokee communities informed about political developments. But how could he convince them to take action based on messages from dead spirits, delivered by a girl most people would assume was delusional? There has to be more, he said. Some kind of physical evidence, something concrete that would convince skeptical minds. Atsila nodded. The spirits know where the government agents are meeting to plan the removal. They've been watching, listening to conversations that living ears were never meant to hear. But we would have to travel to Fort Gibson to find the proof you need. Fort Gibson was a 2-day ride southeast, a military post that served as the unofficial capital of white authority in Cherokee territory. If government agents were indeed planning another forced relocation, that's where the orders would originate. It's too dangerous, Wohali said. Fort Gibson is crawling with soldiers and federal marshals. If we were caught spying on government meetings, then we would be arrested, tried, and probably hanged as enemy agents, Atsila finished calmly. But if we do nothing, thousands of Cherokee will die in the snow and mud of another forced march to nowhere. Wohali studied her face in the firelight. This girl who had been sold like property just hours ago was now asking him to risk both their lives on the word of dead spirits. It should have been an easy decision. The smart, safe choice was to stay hidden in his mountain valley and let others deal with whatever political storms were brewing. But then he thought about Singing Bird, about the wooden horse she still carried in whatever realm she now inhabited. He thought about Kamama's butterfly song and the way she used to hum while grinding corn in the early morning hours. If they were truly trying to warn him, trying to save their people from another trail of tears, how could he ignore their voices? If we do this, he said slowly, we do it carefully. No unnecessary risks, no heroic gestures. We gather information and get out, nothing more. Atsila smiled for the first time since he'd met her, and the expression transformed her entire face. The spirits say you're worried that you'll fail them the way you think you failed your family. But Kamama wants you to know that you never failed anyone. You just forgot how to listen to the voices that have always been trying to guide you. That night, Wohali lay awake on the floor beside the fireplace, having given Atsila his bed. He stared at the ceiling beams and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning, he had been a solitary hunter whose biggest concern was whether the winter would be harsh enough to drive deer down from the high country. Now he was harboring a girl who claimed to speak with the dead, and planning to spy on government agents who might be plotting genocide against his people. It should have felt like madness. Instead, it felt like coming back to life. Across the cabin, Atsila slept fitfully, occasionally murmuring words in Cherokee that sounded like responses to unheard questions. Once, she sat up abruptly and spoke clearly into the darkness. Yes, I'll tell him. But he's going to be angry when he learns the whole truth. Tell me what? Wohali asked quietly. Atsila turned toward him, though he doubted she could see him in the darkness. Your wife says there's something else you need to know about why the spirits led me to you. Something about your own family history that you're sure grandmother never told you. What kind of something? Your great-grandmother, the one they called She Who Walks Between, was like me. She could hear the voices of the dead and deliver their messages to the living. The gift runs in your bloodline, Wohali, but it skipped your generation and your father's generation. It was supposed to manifest in one of your children. Wohali's heart clenched. Singing Bird? She was just beginning to show the signs when the fever took her. Kamama says that's why your daughter's spirit is so strong, why she can speak through me so clearly. She was meant to be a bridge between worlds, just like I am. The implications hit Woli like a physical blow. If Singing Bird had lived, she would have grown up to be a spirit talker like Atsila, able to communicate with the Cherokee ancestors and serve as a guide for the living. Her death hadn't just robbed him of his daughter, it had robbed the Cherokee people of a spiritual guide they would desperately need in the dark times ahead. That's why the spirits brought us together, Atsila continued. I can't replace your daughter, but I can continue the work she was meant to do. Together, we can be the bridge between the living and the dead that the Cherokee Nation needs to survive what's coming. Wohali closed his eyes and listened to the night sounds outside his cabin, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant howl of a wolf calling to its pack. For 3 years, those sounds had been his only companions. Now he shared his home with a girl who claimed his dead family was still with him, still trying to protect and guide him. He should have been skeptical. He should have dismissed her claims as the delusions of a traumatized mind. Instead, he found himself believing every word she had spoken. Maybe it was because he wanted so desperately for it to be true. Or maybe it was because, deep in his heart, he had always known that death wasn't really the end, that love was stronger than the grave, and that the spirits of the ancestors were still watching over their descendants. Either way, tomorrow he would begin preparing for the journey to Fort Gibson. He would listen to the voices of the dead and try to save the living, even if it meant risking everything he had left, because sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to fight, like hell for those who were still breathing. As sleep finally claimed him, Wohali could have sworn he felt a small hand stroking his hair and heard the faint sound of a butterfly song drifting through the darkness. And for the first time in 3 years, the silence in his cabin felt less like emptiness and more like the patient waiting of souls who had never really said goodbye. Dawn came gray and cold to the mountains, with frost coating the cabin windows like intricate Cherokee beadwork. Wohali woke to find Atsila already awake, sitting by the dying fire and sketching something in the dirt floor with a charred stick. As he approached, he saw she had drawn a detailed map showing trails, landmarks, and what appeared to be the layout of Fort Gibson. "The spirits have been busy," she said without looking up. "They've been scouting the route we need to take and watching the movements of the soldiers at the fort. There's a supply wagon leaving Bent Creek Trading Post this afternoon, heading for Fort Gibson. If we can catch up to it, we can follow at a distance and use it as cover for our approach." Wohali studied the dirt map, impressed by its accuracy. He had been to Fort Gibson many times during his army service, and Atsila's sketch matched his memories, perfectly down to the placement of guard towers and the location of the officers' quarters where sensitive meetings would likely take place. "How do they know all this?" he asked. "Dead soldiers," Atsila replied matter-of-factly. "Men who died at the fort during the war and never found their way to the Nightland. They've been wandering the grounds for years, invisible to the living, but able to observe everything that happens there. They say there are at least a dozen spirits trapped within the fort's walls, all of them eager to help expose the corruption they've witnessed." She stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "But we need to leave soon if we're going to intercept that supply wagon. And we'll need to look like travelers, not like a Cherokee hunter and a runaway girl. The spirits suggest we pose as a married couple traveling to visit relatives in Arkansas." The idea of pretending to be married to this strange, gifted girl made Wohali uncomfortable, but he had to admit it was a sensible disguise. A Cherokee man traveling alone would attract suspicion, especially near a military installation. A married couple on a family visit would be far less noteworthy. He gathered supplies for the journey: dried meat, cornbread, his rifle, extra ammunition, and a small pouch of gold coins he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Atsila watched him prepare with the calm attention of someone who had learned to read danger in small details. "You're afraid," she observed. "Of course I'm afraid. We're about to spy on the United States Army based on information from dead people. Fear seems like the appropriate response." Atsila smiled slightly. "Kamama says you were always afraid before. Important hunts too, but that the fear made you more careful, more successful. She says courage isn't the absence of fear, it's hunting despite the fear because something important depends on your success." The casual way she quoted his dead wife's wisdom hit Wohali like a physical blow. Those were almost the exact words Kamama had spoken to him on their wedding night, when he had confessed his nervousness about becoming a husband and eventually a father. As they prepared to leave, Atsila changed into the clean clothes Wohali had offered her the night before. The shirt and pants were too large for her slight frame, but she cinched them with rope and rolled up the sleeves and cuffs until they fit reasonably well. With her hair braided neatly and her face washed clean, she looked less like a desperate waif and more like a young Cherokee woman starting her adult life. They saddled Thunderwalker and set out down the mountain trail, riding double with Atsila seated behind Wohali. The morning air was sharp with the promise of winter, and their breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. As they rode, Atsila maintained a running commentary on the messages she was receiving from various spirits they encountered along the way. "There's a Confederate soldier buried beneath that lightning-struck oak," she said as they passed a particular tree. "He wants his family in Georgia to know that he died thinking of them, not of the cause he was fighting for." A mile further down the trail, 3 Cherokee children drowned in that creek during the harsh winter of 1863. Their grandmother's spirit still searches for them every night, calling their names. She doesn't understand that they've already crossed over and are safe in the Nightland. The constant stream of supernatural information was unsettling, but Wohali found himself oddly comforted by it. If Atsila was right, if the spirits of the Faye Ephasalavs of the Tsela was right, if Asila was right, if the spirits of the dead truly lingered in the world to watch over the living, then perhaps his isolation had been an illusion. Perhaps he had never been as alone as he thought. They reached Bent Creek Trading Post, just as the supply wagon was being loaded for its journey to Fort Gibson. Samuel Bent supervised the loading while his Cherokee wife, Mary, counted supplies from a handwritten list. The wagon was large and heavily loaded, pulled by 4 sturdy mules and driven by a burly white man named Pete Hawkins, whom Wohali recognized from previous visits to the post. "Morning, Wohali," Samuel called as they approached. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon. This your wife?" The question caught Wohali off guard, but Atsila smoothly stepped into the role they had discussed. She moved close to his side and smiled shyly at Samuel, playing the part of a newly married Cherokee woman who was still adjusting to life with her husband. "This is Atsila," Wohali said, surprised by how natural the introduction felt. "We're traveling to visit her relatives near Fort Smith." "Well, congratulations to you both," Samuel said warmly. "Marriage is a fine thing when you find the right person. Mary and I have been blessed with 30 years together, and I wouldn't trade a single day of it." Pete Hawkins climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "We'll be making good time if this weather holds," he announced. "Should reach Fort Gibson by tomorrow evening, God willing." Wohali and Atsila mounted Thunderwalker and fell in behind the supply wagon as it rumbled away from the trading post. They maintained a distance of several hundred yards, close enough to benefit from the wagon's presence on the road, but far enough away to avoid unwanted conversation with Pete Hawkins, who had a reputation as a gossip. The trail to Fort Gibson wound through rolling hills covered with oak and hickory forests painted in autumn colors. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful journey. But as they traveled, Atsila continued to receive messages from spirits they encountered, and the news was increasingly disturbing. "There's a Cherokee family buried beside that stream," she said as they passed a particular landmark. "They were killed by white settlers who wanted their land, but the authorities claimed it was an accident. The father's spirit says similar attacks have been happening all across Cherokee territory, but the tribal council doesn't know because the victims are always isolated families with no powerful connections." "How many attacks?" Wohali asked grimly. Atsila was silent for several minutes, her eyes unfocused as she listened to voices he couldn't hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with sorrow. "Too many to count. The spirits of murdered Cherokee are gathering, all of them carrying the same message. The attacks aren't random. They're being organized by someone who wants to make Cherokee families so afraid that they'll voluntarily leave their land rather than risk being killed for staying." The implications were staggering. If what Atsila was hearing was true, then the planned government removal wasn't just about broken treaties and political maneuvering. It was part of a coordinated campaign of terror designed to make Cherokee resistance impossible. As the day wore on, they began encountering more travelers on the road, merchants heading to Fort Gibson to sell supplies to the army, families relocating to what they hoped would be safer territory, and occasional patrols of soldiers who eyed every Cherokee they passed with barely concealed suspicion. Each encounter required Woholi and Atsila to play their roles as a married couple on a routine family visit, smiling and nodding politely while internally cataloging every detail that might prove useful later. They made camp that evening beside a small stream, building a modest fire and sharing a quiet meal of dried meat and cornbread. Pete Hawkins and his supply wagon were camped about a quarter-mile ahead, close enough that they could see his campfire through the trees, but far enough away to maintain their privacy. As darkness fell, Atsila's demeanor changed. She became more alert, her head turning frequently as if she was tracking movements in the forest around them. Finally, she stood and walked to the edge of their firelight. "They're coming," she said quietly. "Who's coming?" "Cherokee warriors. Dead ones killed during the war. They've been following us all day, and now they want to speak with you directly." Woholi felt the hair on his neck stand up. "What do they want?" Atsila's expression grew distant, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different cadence, deeper, more masculine, with the formal speech patterns of Cherokee warriors. "We are the spirits of those who died fighting for Cherokee freedom," she said, though it was clear that the words were not her own. "We have watched the corruption and betrayal that followed our deaths, and we are angry. The white government plans not just removal, but extermination. They intend to make it impossible for Cherokee people to exist anywhere, forcing us to disappear completely or die trying to resist." "How do you know this?" Woholi asked, feeling slightly foolish for speaking to dead warriors through a 17-year-old. "Girl, we have walked the halls of power in Washington City," came the reply through Atsila's voice. "We have listened to the secret meetings where Cherokee extinction is discussed like a problem to be solved. The officials at Fort Gibson are not the architects of this plan. They are merely tools being used by men whose names you would recognize. Men who speak publicly of Cherokee rights while privately planning Cherokee destruction." "The spirit speaking." Through Atsila paused, and her expression shifted slightly. When she continued, the voice was different, younger, more urgent. "There is a meeting planned for tomorrow night at Fort Gibson. The commanding officer will receive final orders about the removal, orders that include instructions for dealing with Cherokee resistance. You must witness this meeting and carry word of what you learn back to the tribal council. But be warned, the fort's commander, Colonel Morrison, has been told to eliminate any Cherokee who might spread word of the government's true intentions." Atsila's body swayed, and for a moment, Woholi thought she might collapse. Then her eyes focused on his face, and she was herself again. "Did you understand what they told you?" she asked. Woholi nodded grimly. The stakes had just become much higher than he had imagined. They weren't just gathering intelligence anymore. They were walking into a trap where discovery would mean certain death. "There's something else," Atsila continued. "The warrior spirits say that Colonel Morrison isn't acting entirely on government orders. He has his own reasons for wanting Cherokee people eliminated from this territory. Personal reasons that have made him more brutal than even his superiors expected." "What kind of personal reasons?" "His son was killed during a Cherokee raid early in the war. But it wasn't really a Cherokee raid. It was white bandits dressed as Cherokee warriors trying to steal army supplies. Morrison discovered the truth after his son's death, but instead of seeking justice against the real killers, he decided that all Cherokee people were responsible for his loss. The complexity of the situation was becoming overwhelming. They were dealing not just with government policy, but with the personal vengeance of a man in a position to make official policy. Colonel Morrison wasn't just following orders, he was using his authority to wage a private war against an entire people. How are we supposed to get close enough to witness this meeting? Woley asked. The fort will be heavily guarded, especially if they're expecting trouble. Atsila smiled, and there was something almost predatory in her expression. The dead Cherokee warriors have been planning this for months. They know every guard position, every patrol route, every weakness in the fort's defenses. And they have allies among the living Cherokee people who work at the fort as laborers and servants, people who are invisible to the white soldiers, but who see and hear everything. She knelt beside their fire and began drawing another map in the dirt. This one showed the interior layout of Fort Gibson in much greater detail than her previous sketch, including information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the facility. There's a Cherokee woman named Rosa Thornton, who works as a laundress for the officers, Atsila explained as she drew. Her husband was killed fighting for the Union, but she stayed at the fort because she needed the work to support her children. The spirits say she's been secretly documenting the conversation she overhears while cleaning the officers' quarters. She has information that could help us, but she's also in great danger if her activities are discovered. Why would she help us? Because her dead husband has been visiting her in dreams, telling her that something terrible is being planned. She doesn't fully understand what she's seeing and hearing, but she knows it involves harm to Cherokee people. When we arrive at the fort, we need to find her and convince her to trust us with what she's learned. Waholi studied the dirt map, memorizing the details that might save their lives in the next 24 hours. The plan was audacious and dangerous, but it might be their only chance to gather the evidence needed to warn the Cherokee nation of what was coming. As they prepared for sleep, Atsila delivered one final message from the spirit world. Singing Bird wants you to know that she's proud of you for choosing to fight for your people instead of hiding in your grief, she said softly. And Kamama says that whether you succeed or fail in this mission, you have already honored their memory by finding the courage to care about something beyond your own pain. Wahali lay awake long after Atsila had fallen asleep, staring up at the stars and thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 days ago, he had been a broken man living in isolation, convinced that his life held no purpose beyond simple survival. Now he was preparing to risk everything to save his people from a fate that might be worse than death. The transformation should have surprised him, but somehow it felt natural, as if he was finally returning to who he had always been meant to be. The grief would always be part of him, but it no longer had to define him. He could carry his love for Kamama and Singing Bird forward into action, letting their memory inspire him to protect other families from the losses he had endured. Tomorrow, he would walk into Fort Gibson and spy on the United States Army, guided by the spirits of dead warriors and aided by a girl who could hear voices from beyond the grave. It was either the beginning of salvation for the Cherokee people, or the last act of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. Either way, he would face it with the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The dead were walking beside him, and their love was stronger than any fear the living could devise. Fort Gibson loomed against the evening sky like a monument to conquest. Its wooden palisades and stone buildings sprawling across a hilltop that commanded the surrounding river valley. From their concealed position in a grove of cottonwood trees, Wahali and Atsila watched the rhythmic movements of sentries along the walls and noted the locations of guard posts that the spirits had marked as crucial to their infiltration plan. Fort bustled with activity despite the approaching darkness. Supply wagons rolled through the main gate under heavy escort, soldiers drilled in the central parade ground, and smoke rose from dozens of chimneys as the garrison prepared for the evening meal. To any casual observer, it looked like a routine military installation going about its daily business. But Asila's connection to the spirit world revealed a much darker reality. The dead soldiers say there are secret prisoners being held in the root cellar beneath the quartermaster's building, she whispered, her eyes tracking movements that Waholi couldn't see. Cherokee leaders who tried to organize resistance to land seizures. They've been disappearing one by one over the past 3 months, and their families have been told they fled west to avoid military justice. Waholi studied the layout through his field glasses, comparing what he observed to the spirit-guided maps Atsila had drawn. The quartermaster's building sat near the fort's eastern wall, partially hidden behind a row of barracks. If Cherokee prisoners were indeed being held there, rescuing them would complicate their mission exponentially. "We can't save everyone tonight," he said reluctantly. "Our priority has to be gathering evidence of the removal plans and getting that information back to the tribal council." Atsila nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I know. But the spirits of those prisoners are calling out for help. They know they're going to be executed before the removal begins, eliminated as potential leaders who might organize resistance. Their deaths will be blamed on escape attempts or natural causes. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on Waholi's shoulders. Every moment they delayed meant more Cherokee families remained unwarned about the approaching catastrophe. But leaving known prisoners to die violated every principle his grandmother had taught him about protecting the helpless. As they debated their options, a new voice joined their whispered conversation, but this voice came from a living throat. Rosa Thornton emerged from the shadows like a ghost herself, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to be invisible in dangerous places. She was a woman of perhaps 40, her Cherokee features weathered by hard work and harder losses. Her dress was the rough homespun of a laborer, and her hands bore the permanent stains of soap and lye from years of washing soldiers' uniforms. But her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived by observing everything and revealing nothing. "You must be the hunter the spirits told me about," she said, settling beside them with movements that barely disturbed the fallen leaves. "I've been watching for you since yesterday, when my husband's spirit came to me in a dream and said help was finally coming." Waholi tensed, uncertain whether to trust this unexpected ally. "Your husband?" "Sergeant William Thornton, killed at Chickamauga fighting for Cherokee freedom under Stanwati's command. He's been visiting me regularly since his death, warning me about conversations he overhears in the officers' quarters of the spirit world." Rosa's matter-of-fact tone suggested that communication with dead relatives was as normal to her as mourning. "Coffee." She reached into her apron and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "I've been recording everything I hear while cleaning Colonel Morrison's office and quarters. Names, dates, troop movements, supply orders, everything that seemed unusual or secretive. I didn't understand what it all meant until William explained that it was evidence of planned genocide." Atsila took the journal and flipped through its pages, her expression growing increasingly grave. "This is more detailed than anything the spirits could tell us. You've documented specific conversations between Morrison and government agents, including direct quotes about eliminating Cherokee resistance permanently. There's more," Rosa continued. "Morrison has been importing special troops from other territories, men with reputations for brutality, soldiers who won't hesitate to kill Cherokee civilians if ordered to do so. They're being billeted in the old officers' quarters that were supposed to be abandoned, and they're training for something Morrison calls pacification operations. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with terrifying clarity. The planned removal wasn't just about relocating Cherokee families to new territory. It was about eliminating Cherokee identity entirely through systematic murder, disguised as law enforcement. "What about the meeting tonight?" Waholi asked. "The spirit said Morrison would receive final orders about the removal." Rosa's expression darkened. "The meeting is real, but it's not just about receiving orders. Morrison is hosting a gathering of territorial officials, army commanders, and civilian contractors who will profit from Cherokee elimination. They're finalizing the timeline for what they're calling Operation Cherokee Dawn, a coordinated series of raids that will begin in 2 weeks. She pointed toward the fort's administrative building, a 2-story stone structure near the center of the compound. They'll meet in Morrison's private conference room on the 2nd floor, starting at 10 o'clock. The room has only one entrance, but there's a maintenance crawl space above the ceiling that I use when cleaning the upper floors. If you can get into the building, you can reach the crawl space and listen to everything they say. Atsila suddenly stiffened, her head turning toward the fort as if she'd heard something alarming. The spirits are warning about increased patrols tonight. Morrison suspects that Cherokee scouts might try to gather intelligence about military activities. He's tripled the number of sentries and ordered them to shoot any Cherokee found near the fort after dark. The mission had just become exponentially more dangerous, but also more urgent. If Morrison was already suspicious of Cherokee surveillance, then tonight might be their only opportunity to gather the evidence needed to warn their people. "There's a way," Rosa said quietly, "but it requires trust and precise timing. I can get you into the fort during the evening meal, when most of the soldiers are distracted by food and drink. You'll need to hide in the laundry until after dark, then move to the administrative building when the meeting begins." She outlined a plan that relied on her intimate knowledge of the fort's routines and the soldiers' habits. It was risky but feasible, assuming they could avoid the increased patrols and reach their listening post without detection. As full darkness settled over the fort, Rosa led them along a path that wove between supply sheds and storage buildings, avoiding the main thoroughfares where patrols were most likely to appear. Atsila moved like a shadow beside Wohali, occasionally pausing to receive guidance from spirits who served as invisible scouts. "There are 2 guards at the laundry entrance," she whispered as they approached their first objective. "But the spirits of dead Cherokee prisoners say there's a loose board on the north wall that can be moved quietly." They found the hidden entrance, exactly where the spirits had indicated, a section of wall planking that had been carefully loosened from the inside, probably by previous Cherokee infiltrators who hadn't lived to report their discoveries. The board moved silently aside, revealing an opening just large enough for a person to slip through. The interior of the laundry building was filled with the permanent dampness of constantly wet fabric and the harsh chemical smell of soap and bleach. Huge wooden tubs dominated the center of the space, surrounded by drying lines strung with military uniforms and bedding. Rosa guided them to a storage alcove filled with dirty laundry where they could hide until the fort settled into its nighttime routine. "The administrative building will be locked after 9 o'clock, Rosa explained as they waited. "But there's a window on the east side that doesn't latch properly. I've been meaning to report it for repair, but somehow I never get around to it." The hours passed slowly as they listened to the sounds of the fort settling into evening patterns. Soldiers returned from their duties, gathered in the mess halls for dinner, and gradually dispersed to their quarters for sleep or recreation. By 10 o'clock, the compound had grown quiet except for the measured footsteps of sentries and the occasional challenge between guards. Rosa led them out of the laundry through the same concealed entrance, then guided them along a route that stayed in the deepest shadows between buildings. The administrative building loomed before them like a sleeping giant, its windows dark except for a second-floor room where lamplight flickered behind drawn curtains. "That's Morrison's conference room," Rosa breathed. "They're already gathering." The loose window was exactly where she had promised, on the building's east wall where shadows were deepest and sightlines from guard towers were blocked by other structures. Wohali worked the window open with infinite care, testing each movement to ensure it made no sound that might alert the sentries. Inside, the building was nearly pitch black, lit only by thin strips of lamplight seeping beneath doors. Rosa's familiarity with the layout proved invaluable as she guided them through corridors and up a staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and Wahali's nerves were stretched tight with the expectation of discovery. The maintenance crawl space above Morrison's conference room was accessed through a narrow panel in the ceiling of an adjacent storage closet. Rosa had clearly used this route before, climbing into the cramped space with practiced efficiency and gesturing for Woholi and Atsila to follow. The crawl space was barely 3 feet high, forcing them to move on hands and knees across rough wooden beams. Dust and debris filled the air, making it difficult to breathe quietly. But as they reached a position directly above the conference room, voices became audible through gaps in the floorboards. Colonel Morrison's voice was unmistakable, a harsh, authoritative tone that brooked no disagreement. "Gentlemen, thank you for gathering on such short notice. The orders from Washington are clear, and our timeline has been accelerated due to certain security concerns." Through the gaps in the floorboards, Wohali could see fragments of the scene below, uniformed officers seated around a polished table, civilian officials in dark suits, and maps of Cherokee territory spread across every available surface. The lamplight cast dancing shadows that made the gathering look like a council of demons planning apocalypse. "Operation Cherokee Dawn will commence in 10 days, Morrison continued. Simultaneous raids on Cherokee settlements throughout the territory, with priority given to eliminating known leaders and anyone capable of organizing resistance. The official justification will be enforcement of federal warrants for tax evasion and violations of territorial law." A civilian voice responded, someone Wohali didn't recognize but whose tone carried the authority of high government office. "What about the prisoners currently being held? The ones who've been asking inconvenient questions about missing Cherokee families?" Morrison's laugh was cold and satisfied. "They'll be transferred to other facilities tomorrow night. Unfortunately, Cherokee prisoners have a tendency to attempt escape during transport. Such attempts rarely end well." The room erupted in quiet laughter that made Wohali's stomach turn. These men were casually discussing mass murder as if they were planning a hunting expedition. The scope of their conspiracy was even worse than the spirits had warned, not just removal, but systematic extermination disguised as law enforcement. "What about the tribal council?" another voice asked. "Some of those old chiefs still have connections in Washington, friends who might ask uncomfortable questions if they disappear too obviously." "The tribal council will be disbanded by presidential order the day after the raids begin," Morrison replied. "Any surviving Cherokee leaders will be arrested as enemy combatants and transferred to military custody. The Cherokee Nation will cease to exist as a legal entity, and their remaining land will be redistributed to white settlers who've been waiting patiently for this opportunity." Atsila suddenly gripped Woholi's arm with desperate intensity. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was struggling not to cry out. When she leaned close to whisper in his ear, her voice was barely audible. "The spirits are screaming warnings. Morrison has discovered our presence somehow. Armed soldiers are surrounding this building right now." Even as she spoke, Wohali heard the sound he'd been dreading: heavy footsteps on the staircase below, moving with the purposeful rhythm of men prepared for violence. Torchlight began to flicker under doorways as soldiers searched the building. Room by room, Rosa's face was pale with fear, but her voice remained steady. "There's another way out. A maintenance ladder that leads to the roof. From there, we can reach the wall and drop down outside the fort." The sounds of the search were getting closer, accompanied by Morrison's voice shouting orders. "Find them. I know there are Cherokee spies in this building. Search every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. I want them alive if possible, but dead Cherokee are better than escaped Cherokee." They crawled through the dust and darkness toward Rosa's escape route, moving as quickly as silence would allow. Behind them, the conference room had erupted in confusion as the gathered conspirators realized their secret meeting had been compromised. Orders were being shouted, chairs were scraping across floors, and the systematic search was intensifying. The maintenance ladder was hidden behind a false panel that Rosa manipulated with practiced skill. It led upward through a narrow shaft that emerged onto the building's roof, where the night air felt like salvation after the suffocating crawl space. But their escape was far from complete. The roof was exposed to observation from multiple guard towers, and searchlights were beginning to sweep the compound as the alarm spread. The spirits say we have perhaps 2 minutes before the soldiers reach the roof, Atsila whispered urgently. But they also say there's a way to reach safety if we trust them completely. She pointed toward a section of the fort's wall where shadows seemed deeper than they should be. Dead Cherokee warriors are gathering there, creating a blind spot that the living guards cannot see. If we can reach that location, they can guide us to safety. It was a leap of faith in the most literal sense, trusting their lives to the intervention of spirits whose existence most people would deny. But as torchlight began to flicker in the stairwell below and shouts echoed from multiple directions, supernatural assistance seemed like their only hope. They ran across the rooftop in a desperate sprint, leaping from the administrative building to an adjacent barracks, then scrambling down a drain pipe that brought them to ground level near the fort's eastern wall. Every second brought the expectation of discovery, of musket balls whistling through the darkness, of capture and the certain death that would follow. But as they reached the wall section Atsila had indicated, something extraordinary happened. The shadows seemed to deepen around them, creating a pocket of darkness so complete that even their own bodies were invisible. The searchlights passed over their location without detecting them, and the pursuing soldiers ran past as if they couldn't see 3 people standing in plain sight. "Climb," Rosa urged, pointing to handholds in the stone wall that were invisible until touched. "The spirits are hiding us, but their power won't last long." They climbed the wall in supernatural silence, their movements muffled by forces beyond human understanding. At the top, they paused just long enough to see the chaos they were leaving behind: soldiers running in all directions, officers shouting contradictory orders, and Colonel Morrison standing in his conference room window, staring directly at their hiding place with the frustrated rage of a predator who had lost his prey. The drop to the ground outside the fort was 15 feet. But they landed in soft earth that absorbed the impact without injury. As they ran toward the cover of the nearby forest, the sounds of the search began to fade behind them, replaced by the blessed silence of wilderness darkness. They didn't stop running until they reached the grove where Thunder Walker waited, still, saddled and ready for immediate departure. Only then did Wohali allow himself to believe they had actually survived the most dangerous night of his life. "We have everything we need," Rosa said breathlessly, clutching her journal and the additional notes she'd taken during the meeting. Names, dates, specific plans, evidence that will convince even the most skeptical Cherokee leaders that immediate action is required. But as they prepared to ride toward Cherokee territory with their vital intelligence, Atsila delivered news that changed everything. "The spirits say we're too late to warn everyone. Morrison has already sent advance units to begin capturing Cherokee leaders tonight. By the time we reach the tribal council, half of them will already be dead or imprisoned." The race to save the Cherokee nation had begun, and they were already behind. The sound of galloping hooves echoed through the pre-dawn darkness as Wohali pushed Thunder Walker to his limits, racing along Cherokee trails that most white men had never seen. Behind him, Atsila clung to his waist while Rosa Thornton rode her own horse, a sturdy mare she'd managed to acquire during their escape from Fort Gibson. The 3 of them rode in desperate formation, carrying evidence of genocide and prayers that they weren't already too late. "The spirits are screaming," Atsila called over the thunder of hooves. "Cherokee blood is being spilled right now, all across the territory." The advance units Morrison sent out, they're not waiting for the official start of Operation Cherokee Dawn. They're moving against the most dangerous leaders tonight. Wohali's jaw clenched as he urged his horse faster along the narrow mountain trail, Chief Joseph Ridge lived only 15 miles ahead, in a settlement called Honey Creek, where the Cherokee National Committee often gathered for emergency sessions. If Morrison's assassins had targeted Ridge first, they might arrive to find one of the Cherokee Nation's most respected leaders already dead. Rosa rode alongside them with grim determination, her laundress's dress replaced by men's clothing she'd stolen from the fort's supply depot. She'd made the decision to abandon her old life completely, knowing that returning to Fort Gibson would mean certain death once Morrison discovered her role in the intelligence gathering. "My children," she'd said when Waholi questioned her choice to flee with them. "They're grown and living in Arkansas's territory. They'll understand why I had to run, and they'll be safer if no one can connect them to what happened tonight." As they crested a ridge that overlooked Honey Creek settlement, Waholi's worst fears were confirmed. Orange flames licked at the sky where Chief Ridge's house should have been standing, and the acrid smell of burning wood mixed with something much worse, the unmistakable scent of death that any hunter learned to recognize. "Too late," Atsila whispered, her voice breaking. "The spirits of the murdered are rising from that place like smoke. So many voices, all crying out for justice that will never come." They rode into the settlement to find a scene from a nightmare. Houses burned while their occupants lay dead in the muddy streets, cut down by military weapons fired at close range. Men, women, children, Morrison's advance unit had shown no mercy to anyone who might have carried Cherokee blood. Even the settlement's dogs had been shot, their bodies scattered among the human casualties. Waholi dismounted near what remained of Chief Ridge's house, his boots crunching on broken glass and charred wood. The building had been searched thoroughly before, being set ablaze, every document and record destroyed in the flames. But among the ashes, he found something that made his blood run cold. A military-issued knife with "Property of U.S. Army" stamped on the blade. "They didn't even try to hide what they were doing," Rosa said, her voice hollow with shock. "This wasn't meant to look like a Cherokee raid or a civilian massacre. This was a message." Atsila knelt beside the body of an elderly Cherokee woman, her eyes closed in concentration. "She's still here," she whispered. "Her spirit hasn't crossed over yet. She's trying to tell me something." For several long minutes, Atsila remained motionless, apparently listening to words that only she could hear. When she finally opened her eyes, her face was streaked with tears. "They came at midnight," she reported. 50 soldiers in full uniform, led by a captain who knew exactly which houses to target. They had a list of names, and they went through the settlement systematically, killing everyone on that list and burning all the buildings where Cherokee records were kept. "What about survivors?" Waholi asked. "A few families escaped into the woods when the shooting started. They're hiding in the old ceremonial caves about 2 miles north of here. But the soldiers said they'd be back to hunt down anyone who got away." The scope of Morrison's treachery was becoming clear. This wasn't just the beginning of Operation Cherokee Dawn. It was a carefully planned elimination of Cherokee leadership that would leave the nation helpless when the main assault began. Without chiefs, council members, and tribal historians, the Cherokee would have no one to organize resistance or preserve their cultural knowledge. "We need to find Thomas Downing," Waholi said, referring to his old army friend who published the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. "If anyone can get word out to the remaining settlements, it's him." "The spirits say he's already dead," Atsila replied sadly. "Killed at his printing press 3 hours ago. They burned the newspaper building and destroyed all the type making. Sure, no Cherokee publication could ever warn people about what's coming." The systematic nature of the attacks was terrifying in its efficiency. Morrison had clearly been planning this night for months, identifying every Cherokee leader, every source of organized resistance, every means of communication that might rally the people to defend themselves. "What about the tribal council?" Rosa asked. "Surely some of them must have survived." Atsila's expression grew even more grave. "2 council members are dead. 3 more are trapped in their homes while soldiers surround them, waiting for orders to move in. The spirits say there are only a handful of Cherokee leaders left alive in the entire territory, and they don't know they're being hunted. Wohali felt the weight of impossible responsibility settling on his shoulders. With most Cherokee leadership dead or captured, the task of warning the scattered settlements fell to him, a man who had spent 3 years hiding from his own people, who had no official authority or political connections beyond family relationships. "We need to split up," he said finally. "Cover more ground, warn more settlements. It's the only way to save as many people as possible." "No," Atsila said firmly. "The spirits are very clear about this. We have to stay together. There's something else happening, something connected to your family's spirit-talking bloodline. The ancestors are gathering for a reason, and they need both of us present for what's coming." Before Wohali could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the burning settlement. A large group of riders was moving toward them, full gallop, and in the pre-dawn darkness, it was impossible to tell whether they were Cherokee survivors or Morrison soldiers coming to finish the massacre. "Into the woods," Wohali ordered. But Atsila remained motionless, her head tilted in the listening pose that had become so familiar. "Wait," she said. "These are Cherokee survivors from other settlements who've been gathering all night. The spirits of the dead guided them here, hoping to find other living Cherokee who could help them understand what's happening." The approaching riders proved to be a mixed group of Cherokee families who had escaped attacks on their own settlements. They were led by a young man named Samuel Sixkiller, whose father had been a respected war chief before his death in the recent conflict. Samuel carried a rifle and wore the grim expression of someone who had seen too much death in one night. "Wohali!" "Stonecrow," Samuel called as he recognized the hunter. "I hoped we might find you alive. We've been riding from settlement to settlement, finding nothing but ashes and bodies." "How many are dead?" "Too many," Wohali replied. "And more will die unless we can warn the remaining settlements before dawn." Samuel dismounted and approached the group, his followers perhaps 30 Cherokee men, women, and children gathering around to hear what intelligence had been gathered. As Wohali and Rosa shared what they had learned at Fort Gibson, the faces of the survivors grew increasingly desperate. "Operation Cherokee Dawn," Samuel repeated, his voice thick with barely controlled rage. "They're not just taking our land this time. They're erasing us completely." "The question is what we do about it," said an elderly Cherokee woman named Mary Bushyhead, who had been a respected teacher before her school was burned. "We can't fight the United States Army with 30 people and a handful of rifles. We can't fight them with weapons," Atsila said, stepping forward to address the group. "But we might be able to fight them with something they don't understand and can't defend against." She looked around the circle of survivors, her young face reflecting wisdom that seemed to come from beyond her years. "The spirits of our ancestors are gathering in numbers I've never seen before. They're angry about the murders, but they're also preparing for something. They've been waiting for the right moment, the right people, to intervene directly in the world of the living." "What kind of intervention?" Samuel asked skeptically. "I don't know yet. But they keep telling me that the old agreements between the Cherokee and the spirit world are about to be honored in ways that will change everything. They say the white government has broken so many promises that the supernatural treaties are now void, and they're free to act without the restrictions that have bound them since the Cherokee first walked this land." Wohali felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. His grandmother had told him stories of times when the spirits had intervened directly in Cherokee affairs, usually during moments of existential crisis, when the very survival of the people was at stake. But those stories were from the ancient past, when the Cherokee still lived in harmony with the spirit world. "Even if that's true," Mary Bushyhead said, "spirits can't stop bullets or turn back armies. We need practical solutions, not supernatural." "Hope, maybe we need both," Rosa suggested. I've been thinking about the evidence we gathered at Fort Gibson. We have names, dates, specific plans, everything needed to expose Morrison's conspiracy to his superiors in Washington. What if we could get this information to people who have the power to stop Operation Cherokee Dawn? Samuel shook his head. The government officials who ordered this massacre aren't going to be convinced by evidence of their own crimes. They'll just deny everything and eliminate the witnesses. Not all government officials, Rosa insisted. Morrison was bragging about having support from certain politicians, but he also mentioned others who would be problematic if they learned what was happening. There are people in Washington who still believe the Cherokee should be treated as human beings, not animals to be exterminated. Atsila suddenly straightened, her eyes widening with apparent recognition. The spirits are showing me something, a vision of a man in a great building made of white stone. He's reading documents and becoming very angry. They say this man has the power to stop Morrison, but only if he receives the right information in the right way. What man? Wohuli asked. I don't know his name, but he's important, someone who can give orders that even colonels have to obey. The spirits say he's been kept ignorant of what's really happening in Cherokee territory, told lies about voluntary relocation and peaceful resettlement. If he learned the truth, we'd have to get to Washington, Samuel said. That's over 1,000 miles, and Morrison's men are hunting us. We'd never make it. We don't have to get there ourselves, Rosa said thoughtfully. But we need to get the evidence to someone who can make that journey and who has the connections to reach the right people. As they debated options, Atsila began receiving messages from the spirit world that changed everything. Her eyes grew distant, and when she spoke, it was in the voice of someone much older. The great chiefs of the Cherokee past are calling for a final gathering, she said, channeling words from beyond the grave. They say the time for hiding and running is over. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, they will manifest in the world of the living to reclaim what was stolen from their people. But they need living Cherokee to anchor them, to give them the strength to affect physical reality. What does that mean? Mary Bushyhead asked. Atsila's expression shifted, and suddenly she was speaking in the voice of a young girl. It means we're going to help them. Daddy, all the Cherokee who died tonight, and all the ones who died before, we're going to stand together one last time and show the white government that Cherokee people don't disappear just because soldiers want us to. Singing Bird. Wohuli's daughter was speaking through Atsila, and her words carried the weight of prophecy. The assembled Cherokee survivors looked at each other with a mixture of hope and terror. They were being asked to participate in something that defied every law of nature and reason, a supernatural intervention that could either save their people or destroy them all. What exactly are we being asked to do? Samuel asked. Atsila's eyes cleared, and she was herself again. Tomorrow night, we gather at the sacred ground where the Cherokee first made their covenant with the spirits, the place white people call Sequoia's Cave. We bring every living Cherokee we can find, and we perform the old ceremonies that will allow the ancestors to walk among us again. And then what? Mary Bushyhead pressed. Then, Atsila said simply, we show Colonel Morrison and his army what happens when you try to exterminate a people whose ancestors refuse to let them die. The sun was rising over the burned settlement, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Around them, the evidence of Morrison's brutality smoldered in the growing light, a testament to the hatred that had driven him to attempt genocide. But among the ashes and death, something new was stirring, a power that had slept for generations, waiting for the moment when Cherokee survival would depend not on accommodation with white authority, but on the ancient strength of a people who had never truly been conquered. The spirits were gathering, and the final battle for Cherokee existence was about to begin. The moon had abandoned the sky completely when the last Cherokee survivors gathered at Sequoia's Cave. a sacred hollow carved into the mountainside where ancient ceremonies had bound their people to the spirit world for countless generations. Wohali counted nearly 200 Cherokee men, women, children, and elders who had escaped Morrison's death squads and answered the ancestral call for one final stand. Atsila stood at the cave's mouth, her slight figure silhouetted against the darkness within. Around her, the air shimmered with supernatural energy as spirits gathered in numbers that defied comprehension. The living Cherokee could feel their presence, a pressure in the atmosphere, a whisper of wind that carried voices from beyond death. "They're here," Atsila announced, her voice carrying clearly through the crowd. Every Cherokee warrior who ever fell defending this land. Every chief who signed treaties that were broken. Every mother who watched her children die on forced marshes. They've all come to witness the end of suffering. Colonel Morrison's army approached from the valley below. 500 soldiers with artillery and orders to eliminate every Cherokee in the territory. Their torches created a river of light winding through the darkness, accompanied by the metallic sounds of men preparing for slaughter. Samuel Sixkiller raised his rifle, and the other Cherokee men followed suit, perhaps 50 weapons against. "An army. We'll make them pay for what they've done," he declared. "No," Atsila said firmly. "Put down your weapons. This battle won't be won by Cherokee hands alone." As the soldiers surrounded the base of the mountain, Morrison's voice echoed through the darkness, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Cherokee people, you are ordered to surrender immediately. Any resistance will be met with deadly force. You have 5 minutes to comply." Atsila walked deeper into the cave, beckoning the Cherokee to follow. The cavern opened into a vast chamber where petroglyphs covered the walls, ancient Cherokee symbols that seemed to pulse with their own light. At the chamber's center lay a natural altar where generations of Cherokee had offered prayers to their ancestors. "Form a circle," Atsila instructed. "Living and dead together as it was always meant to be." The Cherokee survivors joined hands around the altar while Atsila began chanting in the old language, words that predated European contact and carried the weight of unbroken tradition. As her voice rose and fell, the petroglyphs began glowing brighter, and the presence of spirits became visible to every person in the cave. They appeared as translucent figures, at first Cherokee warriors in traditional dress, chiefs with their regalia, mothers holding children who had died too young. But as the ceremony continued, they grew more solid, more real, until hundreds of ancestral spirits stood among the living, Cherokee with the substance of flesh and bone. Chief Sequoia himself materialized beside the altar, his eyes blazing with supernatural fire. "We made a covenant with this land before the first white man set foot in our territory," he declared in a voice that seemed to come from the mountain itself. "That covenant still holds, and we claim our right to defend what is ours." Outside the cave, Morrison's soldiers began their assault, firing volleys at the Cherokee positions. But the bullets passed harmlessly through the air, stopped by invisible barriers that no military training had prepared them to understand. Artillery shells exploded against the mountainside, without leaving so much as a scratch on the stone. "Impossible," Morrison screamed, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "They're just Indians with old rifles." But as the ancestral spirits emerged from the cave, Morrison's army faced something beyond their comprehension. Cherokee warriors who had died centuries ago charged down the mountainside with weapons that blazed with spiritual fire. They moved through gunfire without harm, striking down soldiers with touches that froze men's hearts in their chests. Wohali watched in awe as his own ancestors joined the supernatural battle warriors from his family line, stretching back to the Cherokee's first days in these mountains. And among them, he saw Kamama and Singing Bird, no longer trapped between worlds but free to protect the people they loved. Morrison himself tried to flee as his army disintegrated around him, but the spirit of Chief Joseph Ridge, the leader, whose murder had started this night of reckoning, blocked his path. The confrontation lasted only moments before Morrison collapsed. His body unmarked, but his spirit shattered by the weight of his crimes. As dawn broke over the mountains, the Cherokee ancestors began to fade, their supernatural intervention complete. But the living Cherokee remained, no longer hunted, no longer in danger of extinction. Word would spread that the Cherokee Nation had survived its darkest hour through powers that no government could challenge or destroy. Atsila took Wooli's hand as the spirits departed, her gift as spirit talker no longer needed, but never forgotten. Together, they had bridged the gap between worlds and saved their people from annihilation. In Washington, government officials would receive reports of Morrison's mysterious defeat and the complete failure of Operation Cherokee Dawn. The official story would blame equipment failures and natural disasters. But the Cherokee would know the truth, that love transcends death, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that a people's ancestors never truly abandoned them. The Cherokee Nation would endure, protected by the spirits of those who came before and guided by the voices of those who could still hear them. And in a cabin beside Crying Wolf Creek, a hunter who had found his purpose and a girl who spoke with the dead would continue their work as guardians of the ancient covenant between the living and the ancestors who watched over them always.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.